Imagine a court case where the murder weapon isn't, a gun or a knife or a vial of poison.
Right.
The weapon is literally just a sentence.
Which is such a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is, because, when we look at foundational human rights, we usually expect some kind of structural clarity.
Yeah, you want clear boundaries.
Exactly. Like, take the right to a fair trial, for instance. That operates within very defined parameters. You have the judge presiding, the defense presents evidence, the jury deliberates.
The mechanics are entirely visible.
Right, you can see the gears turning. But the moment you step into the world of human expression, the mechanics of how we share or even weaponize or suppress ideas, that clarity just totally dissolves.
It does. It forces us to confront this really uncomfortable reality that words don't just, describe the world. They actively construct it.
Yeah,
And sometimes they tear it down.
which is exactly why we're here. Welcome to this deep dive. We have a totally custom-tailored journey for you today, unpacking this incredibly fascinating stack of notes we've been looking at.
It's a heavy stack, too.
Oh, it's dense. And it's all centered on a single explosive question, which is it ever justified to censor speech?
A question that just gets messier the closer you look at it.
So messy.
Yeah.
Because in modern life, we universally celebrate free speech. We operate on this baked-in assumption that bad ideas should be answered, not banned.
Right, the whole marketplace of ideas concept.
Exactly. We tell ourselves that people just have to be free to speak their minds, and that's the absolute cornerstone of democratic life.
And it is.
It is.
Yeah.
But then the reality in our source material complicates this instantly for you listening. We really have to look at what actually happens when speech incites violence.
Or when it manipulates millions of people with coordinated lies.
Yes. Or terrorizes vulnerable populations. Or honestly, perhaps most dangerously, when it destroys the very conditions that allow for free discussion in the first place.
Which means the framing of our entire discussion today really needs to shift away from this simplistic binary.
Right.
Because the core question is not, is free speech good? We already know it is.
Of course it is.
The actual difficult question the nose poses, if it is ever justified to censor speech, where exactly do we draw that line?
And how do we define that boundary without accidentally building a cage for ourselves?
Exactly.
So we promise you a journey today through the philosophy of free expression, the paradox of tolerance, and these incredibly crucial, often ignored distinctions between offense, harm, and threat.
It's going to be a lot to unpack.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can even really talk about limiting speech, we have to establish exactly what's at stake when we silence it.
We need that philosophical baseline.
Right, what are we actually doing when we protect speech?
Well, fundamentally, we are protecting the mechanism of collective human thought.
Oh, I like that phrasing.
Yeah, because speech isn't simply an act of individual expression. It's not like, painting a canvas in a locked room where no one sees it.
Right, it's not happening in a vacuum.
Exactly. In the context of a society, speech is inquiry. It's disagreement, persuasion, truth-seeking. When we speak to one another, we are quite literally thinking together.
Thinking together. That's a powerful way to look at it.
And epistemologically speaking, humanity just doesn't possess some infallible mechanism for determining the truth on the very first try. We're terrible at it, actually.
We really are. We get it wrong all the time.
So we require the friction of opposing ideas to grind away those falsehoods.
So without that friction, a society literally loses its fundamental survival mechanisms.
Precisely.
It loses the ability to question power, to expose corruption, or to just correct massive public mistakes.
Right.
If the public can't point out that a new bridge is structurally unsound,
Or that an economic policy is just completely failing.
yeah, then the society collapses under the weight of its own unexamined errors. So in that sense, speech equals knowledge, democracy, and accountability.
And John Stuart Mill articulated this beautifully back in the day. He argued that if you silence an opinion, you are quite literally robbing the human race.
Robbing them of what exactly?
Well, he says if the silenced opinion is right, society is deprived of the opportunity to exchange error for truth.
Okay, that makes total sense.
But here's the kicker. Even if the silenced opinion is entirely wrong, society loses something almost as important.
Which is?
The clearer perception and a livelier impression of truth, which is produced by its collision with error.
Oh, wow. So even wrong opinions are useful.
Exactly. Because when a true idea is never actually challenged, it just becomes a dead dogma. It loses its vitality. People basically forget why it's true in the first place.
That is fascinating. I was looking at the notes on this before we started, and an analogy from network theory came to mind.
Let's hear it.
Let's think of free speech as a societal immune system,
Okay, I'm following.
right? So when a biological immune system is exposed to low-level pathogens, it studies them. It learns their protein structures and builds these highly specific antibodies. The system becomes resilient.
Right, it gets stronger through exposure.
Exactly. Now, if you take a citizen and shelter them from all quote-unquote dangerous or malignant ideas, basically treating them like a patient in a sterile plastic bubble, their intellectual immune system just completely atrophies.
It forgets how to fight.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the moment that bubble inevitably pops, because it always does, a common ideological cold could just be devastating to them.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The mechanism of that intellectual resilience is just fascinating because we really cannot treat adult citizens like children who require constant shielding.
We can't.
Bad ideas actually need to be highly visible to be defeated.
Which feels counterintuitive to a lot of people.
It does, but forcing them underground doesn't neutralize them. It incubates them.
Oof. It incubates them. That's scary.
Yeah, when a bad idea is suppressed by authority rather than defeated by an actual argument, it gains this seductive, rebellious romance.
Oh, for sure. The forbidden fruit effect.
Yep, exactly. It becomes deeply attractive to those who already feel alienated by the mainstream. So open exposure allows society to drag those bad ideas right out into the sunlight, dismantle their logic publicly, and actually weaken them.
But to execute that, to really make that work, you have to trust the adults in the room to hear the bad idea and actively reject it.
Right, and trusting the public is a huge gamble.
It is.
But the alternative is the profound terror of trusting the censor.
Right. And looking at the historical reality presented in our sources, censorship almost always mutates.
It never stays contained.
Never. It behaves like a gas expanding to fill its container. Like, it might begin with these universally agreed upon intentions, say, stopping a direct, undeniable harm.
Something everyone agrees is bad.
Yeah, exactly. But it inevitably shifts towards silencing dissent or protecting powerful institutions from embarrassment and punishing valid but just unpopular views.
What's fascinating here is the illusion of the neutral arbiter.
Right. Who is the one pushing the mute button?
Exactly. Who's actually doing the censoring? Whether it's a government, a technology platform, or just a really vocal moral majority. Every single one of these entities possesses inherent biases.
And blind spots.
Huge blind spots and the vested interests. The censor is never an objective god.
Never.
I mean, if a government agency is granted the authority to decide what speech is, quote, dangerous to public stability, it will not take long for an investigation into that very agency's corruption to suddenly be classified as a danger to public stability.
Right. You can't investigate us, that's dangerous speech.
Exactly. It's a built-in conflict of interest.
Which means defending free speech is rarely about protecting nice opinions.
Oh, nice opinions require absolutely no defense.
Right. The defense of free speech is fundamentally about protecting the difficult, risky, inconvenient truths.
Yes.
It's about, the whistleblower violating a non-disclosure agreement to expose a corporate cover-up.
Or dissidents challenging a tyrannical regime.
Exactly. Because if speech can be silenced merely because a majority finds it destabilizing, the most necessary truths of our time will just simply vanish.
So we've established a pretty formidable defense of the ideal here.
We have. It sounds great on paper.
But this is the exact pivot point where the philosophy crashes hard into sociology.
Right.
Because the ideal of that societal immune system you mentioned, it assumes that the pathogen is recognizable and that the system actually has time to build those antibodies.
Okay, yeah. I want to push back on my own immune system analogy here for a second.
Go for it.
Because speech isn't always a slow-moving virus that we have time to study under a microscope.
No, it is not.
Sometimes speech is a biological weapon detonated in a crowded room.
That's a terrifying way to put it, but accurate.
Right. So if we love free speech, we still have to admit that speech isn't always just words. Like, when does speech cross that threshold from being an exchange of opinions to becoming a mechanism of real-world harm?
Well, according to the sources, it crosses that threshold when it is weaponized to bypass the rational faculties of the listener and instead trigger immediate destructive action.
Okay, so bypassing the brain entirely.
Pretty much. We are talking about speech used to coordinate physical violence, incite mobs, or systematically target the vulnerable.
Because at that point, it's not a debate anymore.
Right. A direct threat is not an invitation to debate. It is an action. A command to attack is an action.
And here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. Because unrestricted speech can actually destroy the very environment needed for free speech to exist in the first place.
Yes, this is a huge concept in the notes.
Right. This is the paradox of tolerance that our source material highlights.
Karl Popper defined this brilliantly back in 1945, right in the shadow of totalitarianism.
What did he say?
He stated that if a society is tolerant without limit, its ability to be tolerant is eventually seized or destroyed by the intolerant.
Okay, so tolerance is basically a peace treaty, not a suicide pact.
Exactly. Imagine a society so radically committed to absolute free speech that it just allows coordinated factions to use intimidation, doxing, and psychological warfare to terrorize a minority group into total silence.
Right, so the minority group just withdraws from the public square entirely, just to survive.
Precisely the mechanism. The public square then becomes monopolized by the most ruthless actors.
That makes total sense.
Or consider massive-scale disinformation.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
If a coordinated network floods the zone with so much contradictory noise and deliberate falsehood that the public can no longer agree on basic reality, well, public discourse is rendered completely useless.
Because you can't even agree on what you're debating.
Right. You cannot debate tax policy if half the population has been convinced through targeted algorithms that the government is just a holographic illusion.
Yeah, that's impossible. So if free speech is utilized as a shield to normalize violent exclusion and essentially destroy the architecture of the public sphere, the ideal just consumes itself.
It eats its own tail.
Exactly. Meaning, limiting highly corrosive speech might not actually be an attack on free speech. It might be the only way to protect a healthy public sphere where free speech can functionally exist.
And a critical factor in this equation, one that is frequently ignored in these abstract philosophical debates, is the role of power.
Yes, the scale of it all.
Because not all speech acts possess the same kinetic energy.
Right. Scale fundamentally alters the math here. Like a random individual standing in a park shouting a hateful conspiracy theory to, what, 3 pigeons and a tourist?
Right.
They're engaging in a speech act, sure, but the systemic impact is minimal.
It's negligible.
But contrast that with a state-run propaganda machine or a media network with 50 million viewers systematically lying to alter the outcome of an election.
Or a coordinated mob of 10,000 users systematically dismantling a single vulnerable person's life online.
Exactly. You just cannot measure those acts with the same ethical yardstick simply because they both happen to involve vocabulary.
You really can't. The scale of distribution, the inherent power dynamic, the vulnerability of the all of that must be factored into the analysis.
It's not a level playing field.
Not at all. When a massive institution uses its amplified voice to crush a powerless individual, allowing that institution to hide behind the shield of free speech is just a gross distortion of what the principle was originally designed to protect.
Okay, so we acknowledge that free speech is vital,
Yes.
but we also acknowledge that specific forms of speech are objectively dangerous.
Undeniably.
So the challenge now is categorizing it. How do we draw these lines so we don't accidentally empower the biased censor we fear so much? We need, like, a surgical framework.
And we really do, because the most profound mistake made in modern discourse is collapsing all negative speech into a single amorphous bucket labeled toxic or harmful.
Old people do that constantly. Everything they don't like is suddenly harmful.
Right, and this linguistic laziness is incredibly dangerous. We must rigorously separate these 3 categories: offense, harm, and threat.
Okay, let's define these boundaries for you listening, starting with offense.
So offense occurs when speech insults, mocks, or challenges moral beliefs, personal identity, taste, or just general comfort.
Just making someone feel bad.
Basically. And the philosophical consensus in the notes here is unyielding. Offense alone is almost never enough to justify censorship.
Because many of the most vital truths in human history were profoundly offensive to the people who first heard them.
Exactly.
Like pointing out the hypocrisy of a religious institution is deeply offensive to the adherents of that religion.
Arguing for the civil rights of a marginalized group is deeply offensive to a prejudiced majority.
Right. So if the threshold for censorship is simply, I am offended, then all serious public criticism is just instantly paralyzed.
Let's utilize an analogy rooted in software architecture here.
Oh, I like a good software analogy.
Think of offense as a localized bug in a program.
Okay.
It is frustrating. It might cause a really poor user experience. It might make you want to close the application entirely. But it does not threaten the integrity of the server itself. We tolerate the bug because shutting down the entire server to fix a minor aesthetic issue is a massive, irrational overreaction.
I love that. So how do we define harm, then distinguishing it from mere offense? Because as we said, people constantly use the word harm today to simply mean my feelings were severely hurt.
And that's a dangerous conflation. Harm, in a rigorous legal and philosophical sense, requires tangible, measurable damage.
Tangible damage.
It goes far, far beyond subjective discomfort. We are talking about reputational destruction through deliberate falsehoods, such as defamation or libel, that causes someone to actually lose their career.
Or their livelihood.
Right. Or we're talking about sustained, targeted psychological abuse designed to break a person's mental health.
Yeah, that's not just being mean.
No, it's not. Or speech that triggers dangerous panic, like the classic, textbook example of shouting fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire.
Right. So extending your software analogy, harm isn't just a localized bug. Harm is a distributed denial of service, a DDoS attack.
Oh, that's perfect, yes.
Like a single user sending a bad request is an error. That's an offense. But a coordinated botnet sending 10 million requests a second, that is designed to overwhelm the server, crash the system, and make the infrastructure completely unusable.
Exactly. Defamation and targeted harassment overwhelm the infrastructure of a person's life.
Wow. Yeah.
It is not just offensive, it is an active destruction of their ability to function in society.
That captures the structural difference perfectly. And that brings us to the highest level of danger, which is threat and incitement.
This is the absolute red zone.
Right. This is speech that directly promises physical violence, incites immediate harm, or gives explicit commands to attack.
So this goes way beyond a DDoS attack. Threat and incitement is someone literally breaking into the server room with a sledgehammer.
That is exactly what it is.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, our entire framework rests on this sliding scale. The further speech moves away from the realm of abstract ideas and offense.
And the closer it gets to the guy with the sledgehammer in the server room.
Exactly. The stronger the moral and legal case becomes for actually restricting it. Law systems like the United States rely heavily on the imminent lawless action standard for this very reason.
Right. The danger has to be concrete and immediate.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have our categories. We've got offense, harm, and threat. We know what kinds of speech cross the line. Now we must examine who is doing the line drawing.
This is where it gets really complicated.
Because the word censorship is thrown around constantly, and half the time it's used to describe fundamentally different mechanisms of power.
Yes. We absolutely must draw a firm boundary between state law, which is legal censorship, and institutional moderation.
Okay, let's break that down.
Well, state power is the monopoly on violence. When a government bans speech, it enforces that ban with fines, physical arrest, and actual imprisonment.
Right. Guys with guns show up at your house.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because this power is so absolute and so easily expanded by corrupt actors, legal censorship must be kept incredibly, almost painfully limited.
But I'm going to challenge the simplicity of that divide for a second.
Jump in.
Because a lot of people argue that social media platforms, universities, and these massive tech corporations are the new public square.
They certainly act like it.
Right. So if a few tech platforms control, say, 90% of all public discourse, and they just unilaterally decide to ban a specific political viewpoint, telling the user, well, the government didn't arrest you, so it's not censorship, feels like a massive technicality.
I hear that.
Doesn't institutional moderation wield essentially state-like power over the modern mind at this point?
You're touching on what is probably the most pressing structural debate of our era right there. You are highlighting this intense tension between private property rights and the realities of modern digital infrastructure.
Yeah, because it's their servers, but it's our conversation.
Exactly. Yes, a platform removing a user is fundamentally different from a government locking a dissident in a literal cage.
Obviously.
But when a handful of private platforms achieve a quasi-monopoly over the public sphere, their moderation policies completely shape the Overton window of the entire civilization.
Wow. Yeah, they decide what's normal to talk about.
Right. It is not legal censorship, no, but it functions as systemic architectural control.
So what does this all mean for the friction of everyday life? Because people constantly scream censorship when they say something controversial, and then they get boycotted, or they lose a book deal, or they face intense public condemnation.
Right. The whole cancel culture debate.
Exactly. They claim they are being silenced by a mob.
Validating this distinction is so crucial for you listening right now.
Right.
Refusal to engage, boycotts, moral condemnation, and scathing critiques, none of those are censorship.
They aren't.
No, they are just other people speaking back. It is literally the marketplace of ideas functioning at high velocity. If you broadcast a deeply unpopular or offensive idea and 50,000 people aggressively reject your idea and refuse to buy your products, your rights have not been violated.
Because they have free speech, too.
Exactly. You have a right to speak. You do not have a constitutional right to an audience, to a platform, or to freedom from social consequences.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So we have built a really robust theoretical framework here. We know why speech matters, the difference between offense and threat, and the difference between state power and social consequence.
We've got the tools.
Now, we must stress test this framework against the messy, chaotic reality of the hard cases from the source material. Let's start with hate speech.
Hate speech is a brutal category to analyze because the term itself encompasses everything from a really offensive edgelord joke to sophisticated state-sponsored propaganda.
Right. It's a huge spectrum.
We have to analyze that spectrum.
Yeah.
At what point does ugly, repugnant opinion change its molecular structure and become an actual campaign of systematic dehumanization?
We really need to explain how dehumanization actually works, mechanically. Because it's not just people being mean on the internet.
Not at all. It is a neurological and sociological hack.
A hack.
Yes. Dehumanizing speech exploits our tribal in-group and out-group heuristics.
Okay, how so?
By repeatedly associating a specific minority group with vectors of disgust, comparing them to rats or parasites or diseases, the speech actually bypasses the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that handles logical empathy.
Oh, wow.
Instead, it directly triggers the amygdala's disgust response, and over time, it shifts the Overton window of what is considered social acceptable treatment of those people.
I mean, just look at the notes on the Rwandan genocide. The RTLM radio station didn't just wake up one day and order people to kill their neighbors.
No, it was a process.
A long process. For months, they played popular Congolese music, interspersing it with these subtle, seemingly harmless jokes about the Tutsi minority.
Testing the waters.
Exactly. Then the jokes slowly became actual slurs. Then they introduced metaphors, calling them cockroaches. They normalized the language slowly, day by day, systematically dismantling the psychological barrier to murder.
That is chilling.
Right. By the time the actual call to physical violence came, the population had been completely primed to view it as a matter of hygiene, not murder.
And that is the absolute terror of the hard case. You are trying to stop the violence before the physical blow lands, but by doing so, you are technically restricting vocabulary.
Right.
A society really has to ask itself, when does speech become a social weapon, an active preparation for violence, rather than a mere viewpoint?
Yep.
And when it becomes a weapon, does the state have a duty to disarm it before the trigger is pulled?
Man, that is a heavy question. Which brings us to another threat, one that doesn't target a specific marginalized group, but targets the concept of reality itself.
Disinformation.
Disinformation.
Wow.
False speech is incredibly tricky because being wrong isn't illegal.
And it shouldn't be.
Right. But deliberate, large-scale disinformation is entirely different. Let's use an analogy here. Massive, coordinated disinformation is like a group of operatives systematically sneaking into every single home and rewriting the numbers on every thermometer.
Oh, rereading the scale of the thermometer itself.
Exactly. It isn't just someone claiming it's cold outside when it's warm. That's just an error. It's deliberately altering the metric so that nobody knows what Celsius or Fahrenheit even mean anymore.
That's insidious.
If you break the thermometer, the society cannot agree on reality. Half the country thinks the water is freezing. Half the country thinks it is boiling.
And you're completely paralyzed.
Totally. You cannot pass legislation. You cannot respond to a public health pandemic. You cannot hold a functional election. Deliberate, scaled lies destroy the basic epistemic tools we use to govern ourselves.
This raises an important question, however, actually a terrifying counter-question based on the notes.
Let's hear it.
How do we repair the thermometer without creating an all-powerful supreme calibrator?
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. The moment you grant a government agency, or a tech monopoly, the ultimate authority to declare what is true with a capital T and what is disinformation, you have handed them the ultimate tool for tyranny.
Because what happens when the calibrator decides to freeze the economy and lies about the temperature themselves?
Exactly. They will inevitably label their own failures as truth. and label their opponent's perfectly valid criticisms as disinformation.
Which means the cure might actually be vastly worse than the disease.
It's a huge risk.
We know disinformation is eroding the load-bearing walls of society, but the centralized authority required to completely purge it might just bulldoze democracy even faster.
It is an excruciating tightrope walk.
It really is. And finally, looking at the last hard case in the notes, we must look at blasphemy and sacred offense.
This is a profound issue globally, not just in the West.
Right. Many societies operate on this deeply held belief that certain religious ideas, sacred texts, or national myths are so foundational to their culture that insulting them causes a spiritual or societal harm.
And they believe that harm justifies strict censorship.
But the notes are unequivocal on the liberal democratic response to this. Sacredness alone cannot and must not justify censorship.
It absolutely cannot. Because if "this is sacred to me" becomes a universally valid justification to silence another person, the public sphere shrinks to the size of a postage stamp.
Everyone holds something sacred.
Exactly. Religious frameworks and national myths are some of the most powerful organizing forces in human history. Because they govern how billions of people live, they must remain entirely open to criticism, to rigorous debate, and frankly, to brutal satire.
Right, because if you shield the sacred from criticism, human progress just freezes.
It halts entirely.
You cannot reform a corrupt religious institution, and you cannot challenge a deeply oppressive cultural tradition if the very act of questioning it is classified as a crime.
You can't.
The protection of free speech requires us to accept the profound discomfort that our most deeply held, fundamental beliefs might be mocked or totally dismantled by our neighbors.
So we have navigated from the idealistic immune system of free expression into the dark paradoxes of weaponized language, through the architecture of offense versus harm, and into the minefields of dehumanization and truth policing.
It's been a journey. So for you listening right now, trying to synthesize all of this into a functional worldview, what is the blueprint here?
Well, the blueprint that emerges from synthesizing all these philosophical and historical realities in the notes is a principle of maximum freedom, narrow limits.
Maximum freedom, narrow limits.
The default setting for any free society must always be to protect speech as widely as possible. We must tolerate offense. We must tolerate messy, chaotic, deeply uncomfortable disagreement.
Even when it hurts our feelings.
Especially then. We protect it to ensure that the immune system functions, that truth can be relentlessly pursued, and that society retains its capacity to correct its own catastrophic errors.
But we acknowledge that the immune system can be overwhelmed by a biological weapon.
Right.
Exceptions must exist.
However, those exceptions, direct threats, incitement to imminent violence, severe and targeted harassment, they must be incredibly narrow.
Surgical.
Yes. They must be grounded in clear structural principles of concrete harm, never mere offense. They must be transparently enforced. And above all, any restriction on speech, no matter how noble the intention, must constantly be subject to severe, unapologetic public criticism.
Because a free society isn't some utopian fantasy where speech is never challenged and everyone politely agrees all the time.
Not at all.
A free society is one where dangerous power, whether it wields a sledgehammer or a mute button, is watched with relentless suspicion.
Always.
Censorship must always be treated as a morally risky last resort in extreme circumstances, never as moral comfort. It should honestly never feel good to silence someone.
As we conclude this deep dive, the source material leaves us with some profound reflection questions that we really want to turn directly over to you.
Yeah. Next time you find yourself wanting a piece of speech to be censored, and let's be honest, we all experience that visceral impulse when confronted with something truly abhorrent. Ask yourself, what exactly are you trying to protect?
Are you trying to protect vulnerable people from actual physical harm?
Are you trying to protect the integrity of the truth?
Or are you simply trying to protect your own psychological comfort?
And consider this as well. Are you more afraid of the harmful speech itself? Or are you more afraid of the institutions and authorities that will inevitably claim the right to silence it?
It is a precarious balance.
It really is. But before we go, there is one final, pretty provocative paradigm shift to consider. Something outside the notes for you to mull over.
Yeah, we have spent this entire deep dive debating the philosophy of human censors.
Right, people.
We have analyzed governments passing laws, mobs demanding boycotts, and human moderators wrestling with the nuances of hate speech. We've debated the flaws of human judgment.
But what happens when the censor is not human at all?
Exactly,
Yeah.
because we are rapidly transitioning into an era of algorithmic censorship.
Tell you.
The mathematical models that control our digital feeds, they don't ban ideas outright. An outright ban causes public outrage and debate.
People notice a ban.
Right.
Yeah.
Instead, algorithms quietly and invisibly downrank complex, controversial, or deeply uncomfortable speech simply because it does not generate the fictionless engagement required for ad revenue.
Wow. They just bury the friction to keep us scrolling happily.
Yes.
So, as these opaque systems silently dictate the parameters of our collective thought, are we entering an era where dangerous, challenging, or revolutionary ideas aren't dramatically crushed by a tyrant, but simply disappear in silence, without us ever even noticing they're gone?